And so, with that said, I want to welcome you to a special edition of the Rodney Kendall podcast. My name is Rodney K. Nickens Jr. I am the host and creator of the Rodney Kendall podcast. And tonight, I will be providing live coverage of the State of the Union Address 2026. Before I do that, I'm going to encourage you all to go over to YouTube with me as I sit down with Arrington Gavin on the Arrington Gavin Show. Tonight, I'm going to talk about why this matters to not just politicals and folks who, like me, follow politics, work in politics, and live, eat, and breathe politics, but to every American. I'm going to talk about my campaign for the Virginia House of Delegates last year, what I learned as a first-time candidate, and what I'm still learning. I'm going to talk about why I started my firm, R&N Strategies, to help support candidates like myself, first-time candidates, candidates from communities of color, candidates from working class backgrounds, and LGBTQ and women candidates. And I'm going to also talk about why I started the Rodney Kendall podcast to begin with. But most importantly, I'm going to talk about why this year and this midterm election is probably the most critical election in the history of our nation. But before we go into tonight's events, I want to set the stage for what we are about to witness. So let's start with immigration, because that's where Donald Trump started, or where he's going to spend the most of his time tonight. This is the political center of gravity for this administration. Here's what I want you to understand. There's a real debate to be had about immigration in the United States. There's a real debate to be had about immigration policy in the United States. How many people come to this country? Through what process? Under what rules? That's a legitimate policy conversation. Now, what this administration is doing, that is not a conversation. What we are watching is the use of immigration, the imagery, the fear, the language of invasion as a political instrument. And it is working on the American people as it was designed to do. But here's what this administration is not telling you. Unauthorized administration to this country has been declining for over a year. The numbers at the border have dropped significantly before many of this president's actions and executive orders ever took effect. The crisis at our southern border has been managed, imperfectly, albeit yes, but the trajectory was already moving in the right direction. That fact doesn't make it onto the poster boards or the billboards, or to what you will see in the chamber tonight. This president has abused his authority by delegating power to the United States Department of Homeland Security and Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and to Customs and Border Patrol to terrorize American citizens. We have seen that most vividly and most disturbingly in Minnesota, with the tragic deaths of Renee Good and Alex Preddy. But we've also seen it across the nation, in California with Keith Porter, in Texas, in Arizona, in Virginia, in Philadelphia, in Tennessee, all around the country. American citizens and our immigrant neighbors and friends are being terrorized, brutalized, kidnapped, and sent around the world and here in the United States in what can only be described as concentration camps. Now, the executive orders. Let's talk about what's actually happening legally. This administration has invoked the Alien Enemies Act of 1798, a law written when John Adams was president. And we were worried about French spies to justify the deportation of citizens and residents in this country without standard due process. Federal courts have pushed back multiple injunctions because the Constitution of the United States is the rule of the land, is the law of the land, even for non-U.S. citizens on U.S. soil. And that law, the Constitution, requires process before the government deprives someone of their liberty and of their freedom and puts them on a plane around the world. The Fifth Amendment to the United States Constitution says that no person, not no citizen, no person shall be deprived of liberty without due process of law. That word matters. The framers chose it deliberately. And yet the messaging tonight will be the courts are getting in the way. The courts are a disgrace. The courts are un-American and unelected. The framers chose it deliberately. And yet the messaging tonight will be that the courts are getting in the way, activist judges, democratic obstruction. But let me tell you something. That is not what's happening today. What's happening is that the judiciary is doing its job, the third branch of government. And this administration is treating our courts as a problem to be solved, rather than a feature of constitutional design. My fellow Americans, I want you to watch tonight. If you hear the phrase, "we will not stop," or "no one can stop us," in reference to deportations, that's not rhetoric. That is a governing posture. That is a president out of control, telling you, the American people, the tax-paying citizens of this nation, that he views judicial review as an obstacle, not a check on his power. And I want to say something about the human beings caught up in the middle of this fight, because we can get so deep in the legal analysis that we forget that there are men and women, boys and girls, children and elders being swept up in this administration's immigration actions. These are our neighbors, our friends, some of our family. These are people, human beings with dignity, who deserve to be treated with respect and due process. People with families, people with jobs, people who have been here for years, decades in some cases, and people who are now living in terror, living in fear, in a way that is not incidental to policy. That's the point of this administration's cruelty. Fear is the mechanism. That's not a partisan statement. That's a description of what's happening across America, here in Virginia, from Richmond to Norfolk, from Virginia Beach to Arlington. That is what's happening in our communities and in our streets. Now, what should our response be? Because it can't just be outrage. Here's the tr- Here's the strategic response for our side. Court challenges are working. Every injunction matters. The legal strategy, the filings, the litigating, the appealing, the protest, the demonstrations, none of it is performative. That is the actual check on this power. Organizations like the ACLU and Democracy Docket, NILC, and Indivisible are doing the work. Support them. And let me be clear, state level action matters. States like Virginia, Maryland, New York, California, Illinois all have their own resources, their own law enforcement decisions, their own degrees of cooperation with federal immigration authorities and enforcement. State legislative fights, like the fight that we're waging right here in Richmond, are not sideshows. They are the front lines. And to my friends in media and journalism, narrative matters. Every time someone tells a specific story about the abuses of this administration, a name, a family, a community, rather than a statistic or a soundbite, the political calculus shifts. We know this, and we have to keep doing it. All right, let's move to the economy. Because this is where the rhetoric will get more sophisticated, just in a different way. The economy section is where the presidential speech gets the most creative with data. So let me give you a framework before we get into the specifics. Presidential economic data is selectively real. They're not made up numbers, usually, but these are not usual times. This president will choose which numbers to say out loud, which numbers to hide, from where to start, and compare that to his own baseline. That isn't a skill. That is a practice manipulation. And we should practice the reverse. Here's what he will probably emphasize: job numbers, stock market performance, manufacturing, and trade deals. But let me tell you something. His likely use of the word historic will be more than once, but it will be less than true. Here's what he probably won't emphasize: inflation, specifically grocery prices, because I know we are all struggling with the cost of groceries, housing costs, energy prices. Those are the categories that everyday Americans actually feel. The president will probably talk about the aggregate CPI, Consumer Price Index, and how that has come down. But the cumulative price increases over the last 4 years. And those are the prices that are still sitting in people's household budgets. A number going from 9% to 3% doesn't mean prices went down. It means that they went up slowly. Tariffs, that'll probably be a big one. This administration has imposed significant tariffs on imports from China, Canada, Mexico, and several of our other trading partners. Imports are the goods that you and I depend on every day. The argument is that his tariffs have brought manufacturing back to the United States and has protected American workers. But the argument falls on deaf ears. Just ask the Supreme Court, which recently ruled this week that his tariffs are unconstitutional. Hold that thought. Somebody is blowing my phone up. All right. But here's what's also true. This president has imposed tariffs as a tax on imports. And imports are taxed not to the importer, but to the consumer. The consumers are the people that pay that tax. It's passed on to retailers, and retailers pass it on to everyday Americans like you and me. So when the price of a washing machine or a car part or a piece of lumber goes up, that's the tariff working as designed. And that's the cause being shifted to the American people, not on a foreign government. Now, some economists support strategic tariffs in targeted scenarios. That's a debate that we should have. But that's a debate that should be held in Congress and not an imposition imposed on the American people by the President of the United States. But that is what this administration is doing. It's tariff as political performance, tariffs as leverage in negotiations and political theater. And what that has resulted in is the destabilization of supply chains across the planet, rattling financial markets, creating genuine uncertainty for American businesses that rely on imports. In fact, according to the Peterson Institute and multiple independent analyses, broad tariffs at current levels effectively function as a $2,000 annual tax on the American people. That's the economy this president will talk about. And then there's the stock market. He's going to talk about how the stock market is booming. But you and I both know the stock market is not the economy. The stock market measures financial performance of large corporations and the expectations of investors about future profits. It does not measure wage growth. It does not measure housing affordability. It does not measure whether people at the bottom of the economy have more or less than they did 4 years ago. 60% of Americans own no stock at all. And so when you hear that the market is up, that's real for investors. Absolutely. But for the majority of working Americans, it is essentially noise. I'm not telling you the economy is a disaster, but I'm telling you that the economy is complicated. And the version you'll hear tonight is curated for political effect. Our job, your job, my job, is to hold the full picture. One more thing on the economy: housing. If the president mentions housing tonight, it will probably be as an afterthought. Or it was a promise about permitting reform, a promise that will likely sound reasonable, but will go nowhere. Housing is the single biggest driver of economic anxiety for every American under 50 in this country. Rents, housing prices, affordability, everything that you'll likely hear tonight will absolutely be absent from this administration's actual governing agenda. Now let's talk about courts, because this is where we get into the constitutional questions that actually keep me up at night. I want to talk about power. Specifically, I want to talk about what this administration believes about presidential power, because it's not a fringe issue anymore. It's become the governing theory of the executive branch of this government. And that theory is called the unitary executive theory. At its most modest, it says that the president has broad authority to control all executive branch agencies and personnel. That's a defensible reading of Article 2, although scholars have debated it, but it's within the mainstream. But what this administration has been doing, that's not the modest version. The version we are living under is a version that says that the president's authority in certain domains like national security or immigration or executive administration is so broad that it essentially is unreviewable. The courts have limited power to second guess, and that the spending appropriated by Congress can be impounded or withheld if the president disagrees with its purpose. I want to be precise here because this is important. Impounding, the president refusing to spend money that Congress has lawfully appropriated and legally required to be spent. That was tried back in the days of Richard Nixon. Congress responded by passing the Congressional Budget and Impoundment Control Act of 1974. It's the law. It says the president can't simply refuse to spend congressionally appropriate funds without congressional approval. We are watching this administration test whether that law has teeth. That's not hyperbole. That is what's happening today. And so these are just a few of the topics which I expect to come up tonight. And throughout the night, I will be providing commentary across platforms, including here on Substack. I want you to pay attention. I want you to listen closely. And I want you to make your voices heard. Thank you for tuning in to my platforms and to my live streams and to my commentary tonight. I want you to know that I am going to watch the State of the Union so that you don't have to. I'm going to watch the responses to the State of the Union, and I'm going to provide live commentary and analysis in real time so that we can all make sense of what is happening to our country in this moment. Join the conversation, stay engaged, and make your voices heard. Thank you so much.